Hello. We're here today with my friend Marguerite Joly. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself in a second, but one of the reasons I wanted to talk to Marguerite is because she's a friend, and I think she also has some interesting perspectives to share. Since I've been sharing a lot of books, I think she has an interesting perspective to share on books and reading generally. So, hi.
Hi, thank you for having me. So my name is Marguerite. I am pretty much first and foremost a reader. I think that's what my Twitter bio says in any case. And not only am I a lifelong reader, but I also, very luckily for me, ended up working in publishing, although on the marketing side of things, not on the editorial side of things. And yeah, that's kind of it.
And if you were a reader, what got you into reading?
Well, my parents are both worked in the humanities and were teachers. We had an enormous library of books, and I also grew up in the 80s where televisions were around, but there were no other screens to distract us from anything. So reading was kind of my thing. My parents read to me. The myth goes that I taught myself how to read, one of those, and never stopped. It was a way for me. I was very shy. It was a way to escape into other worlds, other stories, other people's perspectives. And yeah, I had nonstop access to a very, very large library. My parents liked that I read, and my siblings read, and it was part of the conversation around the table that, books were always a part of that. And so that's how I got into it, I guess.
And you've brought us some books today to kind of point to different moments in your reading history. What's the first one you want to talk to us about?
So the first one I didn't bring, but it occurred to me as I was telling you how I got into reading in giant quotation marks. One of the books that kickstarted a very long love affair with the English language was Roald Dahl's Matilda, which is about books, and about reading, and also about a British girl, and got me into reading all of Roald Dahl's books, and wishing that I too could go to boarding school, for instance, which in fact is something that I later on did in order to learn to speak English. So that's one very concrete way in which reading has influenced my life, which sounds very grandiose. Another book that I brought to you was one that also changed my understanding of how I view myself. I'm French. I grew up in Germany. I went to middle school and high school in Germany. So the context of the Second World War, the Shoah, was for very obvious reasons a huge part of what we were taught in school. It's very fitting also that I'm talking about this on May 8th. And this book here, Marguerite Duras' La Douleur, was a book that made me understand that that history always has many sides, that sounds very trite, but that as a young woman growing up in Germany with the German discourse, I was shaped in that particular way, in a good way, whereas had I been growing up in France and having French history lessons, I would have had a completely different story. This book by Marguerite Duras, most people know her because she wrote The Lover, which is also a beautiful book, but a completely different story. This book is an autobiographical book in which she talks about the absence of her husband, Robert Antelme, who was also a writer, who was a resistance fighter and was taken to a camp in Germany. And she writes about the fights of the resistance, as well as the fight for her to get him to come back to France, to be liberated, to even find out if he was dead or alive. And it's La Douleur means pain, the pain, and it's a staggering book. And I can only urge everyone and anyone to read it. I believe it's been translated in many languages. So that one was, my identity is multiple, and that's okay. That's that book.
How old were you when you read it?
I think I was in my very late teens, early, like maybe 20, something like that.
Okay. And you've got some books that are a little bit more recent you want to
Yeah,
talk to us about.
a little bit more recent, maybe also slightly more fun. I don't know. This one's also, so to preface this, I generally do a list of the 5 books I read in a year that I like the most because I'm very nerdy. And this is one book I read, I think sometime in January or February this year. I don't know how to do the YouTube thing of like placing the thing correctly,
You're
but
fine.
you
You're
get it.
fine.
This book is written by a Yugoslavian kid my age. He's not a kid anymore, but it's a book. Herkunft means origin, and it's about him. It's about his childhood in the former Yugoslavia, escaping from Yugoslavia, rebuilding a life and rebuilding an identity for himself and his family. What identity means, what it doesn't mean. What it means specifically to be doing this in Germany. And it's another extremely beautiful book about one's quest for identity. So that one is probably going to be the number 1 book of the books I read this year. It's available in English and French, and I think it's been translated in many languages.
Is that a bit of a thread? Because obviously between you looking to Matilda for inspiration on boarding schools and then looking to Marguerite Duras to understand, your complex history, and then this book is, the more recent complexities of being a migrant, which both you and I are in some sense. Is that, you think, a bit of a thread in your reading and your reading interests?
Um, so I read pretty much everything and anything. I don't have a particularly highbrow penchant. I read a lot of romance, really a lot of romance, and I'm not afraid to say it. um, so I wouldn't necessarily say that it's been about getting to that I've been reading to know myself better, but it's definitely been reading as a way to understand the world better and to get a different context into different perspectives. But it's also very, very, very much about being entertained.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much first of all, it's a pleasure for me to read, and it's something that I do every day without fail. It's not a chore. It's before I turn off the light, I read a book, no matter how tired I am. And so I would say it's about good stories as well as about good writing, as well as about learning and understanding and entertainment.
And is that something that you then are able to pass on to your kids, for example?
So I'm super happy that I got my children into reading, and I'm saying this as if it was an active act. I don't know that it is. I have no, I have only my own family to look at to determine whether this is how you should do it. But my children have always seen me reading, not just, funnily enough, not just paper books, but also I read digitally a lot, so I read on my iPad. My kids have hardly any access to devices. We're very strict. See also the part of me where I'd already admitted to being very nerdy and earnest. But they always saw me, and my husband too, but me mostly read. I've also always been able to steer them towards books that I think they would have enjoyed, which also made a difference. So once they started reading and they liked it, I was able to constantly fuel that, to always have you could read this, you could read that. Funnily enough, they also resist my recommendations just as hard as I resisted my parents' recommendations. I would always be like, no, I don't want to read the books that you told me to read. Those are not good books. And then my parents ended up being right most of the time.
Is it also, and as someone working in publishing who understands that world, is it helpful to think of books as being for young kids or young adults or adults? Is there you know, a risk to that, making people sort of stick to a category of reading at a particular time in their life?
That's a very interesting question. I think that as from the business perspective, we as marketers know that there's a point at which we can't reach kids anymore because they are more influenced. They're not influenced by their parents anymore at around the age of 12. So from age 12 to sort of 16, 17, there's this sort of gap of kids that we can't reach because they're not necessarily very online. Their peers are not recommending books. They're not going into libraries by themselves. And we have to find creative ways to reach them and tell them about the books that we think they should be reading. Other than that, I find it's very much publishing to think of your book as belonging into a specific category, just as much as to think that this is a book for everybody. Everybody will love this. Both of those things are hardly ever true. And figuring out who your audience is one of the fun parts of being a marketing person in publishing. I think that looking at categories such as teen or young adult books or literature very often comes with a notion of shame attached to it, which I don't like. Similar to what I was telling you earlier about romance, I hardly ever bring a romance book because, again, those are mostly books that I read in the digital format. But I don't like the way in which romance readers, which are often women, or young adult readers, also often women, are shamed for reading tastes that are perceived to be lowbrow. I think any reading is valuable. If reading Harry Potter for the 20th time is your jam, read Harry Potter for the 20th time. It's awesome. So I try to not box it down, and I try to think about what makes this book a book that a person who has read Harry Potter, for instance, why would that person enjoy this particular book? So I try to make it more about the context than about who should be reading this. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It makes me think of also the, and I wonder whether you have a perspective on this, the digitization of books also means that perhaps if you go to someone's home, you don't actually see what they read anymore because they're able to hide the thing that is perceived as shameful, or 50 Shades of Grey or whatever it might be, away from view, and therefore hide some of what gives them pleasure, really. And I wonder whether, to go back to sort of how you treat reading for your kids, if some of the books that you've talked about today are things that you've given to your kids because you've enjoyed them.
Mm-hmm. So I want to share two small anecdotes with that. Sometime, I think in 2012, IKEA removed books from their catalog. And there was massive lobbying around the world from the book industry to have IKEA put books back in their catalogs. So I think that's a fun anecdote that goes hand in hand with what you were saying about the digital format, which incidentally, with respect to whether I pass my book recommendations on to my kids, because so many of the books I read are in digital format and they really hate reading digitally. It's one of the things about digital that really is a bummer, that you can't pass the books on. You have to have the other person buy it, or have a device that you can share it on. That's just an aside. I've recently, my oldest child is going to be 15 in 2 weeks, and we've all been in lockdown now, or sheltering in place, or whatever word you want to use, for the past who even knows how many weeks. So his reading and my reading have picked up accordingly massively, and he just reads everything and anything, and we're very similar. And I gave him this one, My liste de 40 Gales, Réparer les vivants. In English, I believe it is called The Heart, which is I think I want to say 2017 or 2018 personal book of the year, which he deemed to be probably the best book he has ever read, which is high praise indeed. This book is about a boy of 18. The book begins with a boy of 18 dying and revolves around all the people involved in his death and what happens after, because he's a donor and he passes his heart on to another person. So from the surgeon to the nurse to his girlfriend to his mother to the donor's family, everybody is included in this extremely rich tapestry of a surgery and a heart and what it means to give life. And
And
it's
care, it's circles of care,
yes,
isn't it?
yes, exactly right. Circles of care is exactly right, and it's extremely moving. Her writing is also completely out of this world. She writes sentences that can go over many pages. And you don't even you run with her. Like when she describes a person running, you're running with her. And it's an extremely worthwhile book, but I'm not sure it would be for everybody's taste. That's another caveat.
That's the professional in you coming out.
Yes.
I think Circles of Care is a wonderful place to stop. I thank you very much for your time from Berlin today, and hope that everybody enjoys.
Thank you.